Good afternoon and welcome. We're going to get started today, and we appreciate you coming out and the little break in the storm. So it's nice. Yesterday it was quite a hairy day, so we're very excited that the weather's a little better today. My name's Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California. And we want to thank you for joining us. And this is not our first event of the year. It's in my notes. So this is like our second or third survey of the year. For you, those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in San Francisco and in Sacramento. And for today's program, we are going to learn the finding of PPIC's latest survey, statewide survey of Californians and their government. This research was supported with funding from the James Irvine Foundation, the PPIC Donor Circle, and we would like to thank them for the support of this work. We'd also like to acknowledge the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for their support of the event, as well as our lovely lunch. At registration, you should have received a document that contains some key findings from the survey, the full report, along with the crosstabs and time trends for adults and likely voters, as well as the slides from today's presentation are now available online. I really recommend them. It's actually how I got very intimately involved in PPIC. I'd often call the researchers and ask them questions, and we keep all of those up online, so our prior year surveys are online as well. After the presentations, we should have plenty of time for our audience question and answer. Remember that we are videotaping, so wait for the microphone to come to you. And for a few more things before we begin, we want to let you know about some upcoming events. On April 3rd, we will be talking about water and the future of San Joaquin Valley. I know it's going to be raining that day, so it's going to be great. We're going to have a fantastic panel of state leaders on this issue. And on April 15th, our event will be on emergency department use in California, also with another great panel of experts. Both events will take place here, and you can sign up online right now at ppic.org. And later today, you'll receive a short survey via email. And we ask that you please take a few moments on the survey. Our survey team loves surveys, and we do look at those survey results and adjust our efforts accordingly. And please turn off your cell phones. Okay, this poll touches on so many interesting topics. It's a little ADD, it's a little like me, so it's great. It's one of my favorites. I'm only going to touch on a few because I've been told by my survey team I steal their thunder a lot. I don't know what they're talking about, but it's always somebody else's thunder. The first things that strikes me is there's a lot of agreement among Californians in this poll. I'm going to start with taxes because it's top of mind. I was working on them last night, and for the record, yeah, it wasn't fun. I don't know if I owe yet this year, so I don't know if I'm driving to the post office at midnight, which is what I do when I owe, and so I hope not to see you all there. Over 50% of voters think state and local taxes are either not too fair or not fair, and over 60% of voters say they pay more than they think they should. This question might have been asked at a very sensitive time in end of March or early April, but this is interesting in light of the governor's proposal for tax increases before the legislature and the effort by some members in a press conference yesterday to talk about lowering the threshold for future taxes. So it's very timely. Another major area of agreement across parties, across regions, is housing affordability. This actually is something I talked to the San Francisco office about a lot. Most of our researchers are in San Francisco. And while they may have that beautiful Bay Bridge and some really nice scenes of the ocean water and things of that nature, I tell them we can afford our houses here in Sacramento. So they don't enjoy that joke as much as I do, but it's fun. But if you look at the polling, it's actually not just the Bay Area and Los Angeles who has concerns about a housing affordability. It's across all regions of the state. And one of the things that I think, if they ever ask this question, that really gets people mad is that if you ask, do you think your grandchildren will move back here? And most people say no, and that's kind of an interesting thing. The legislature and the governor are exploring many different ways to try to get at this difficult issue, including examining land use policies, governmental fees, and revisiting the rent control measure that was on the ballot in November. PPIC has explored this issue in one of our interactive maps that I'd like to recommend to you on childhood poverty. While we didn't outline solutions to increasing housing production, the 2017 report pointed out that bringing housing costs in line with the 90th percentile nationwide would drop child poverty by 1.6 percentage points. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you know that raising the minimum wage to $15 would drop it by 1.3, to expand a per child credit would drop it by 1.4, and an ETIC expansion would drop it by 0.3%. That makes housing a really interesting and important part of poverty solutions. All of those options, the EITC and the per child credit, are important tools for fighting poverty, but most of those have a cost to the taxpayers. And some of the solutions for resolving our housing situation doesn't involve taxpayer dollars, going back to our taxpayer question. So it's one of my favorite questions. There's so much more in the survey, but I have to leave some small, insignificant issues to Dean, like death penalty, wildfires, and should Senator Harris run? And I'm sure you're excited about hearing the answers there. And I'd like to introduce now Dean Bonner, who is an Associate Director of the PPIC Statewide Survey. Let's welcome Dean.
I'd just like to go on record of saying that I always appreciate Deborah's thoughtful comments, and as one of those people who live in San Francisco and work out of that office, what's a house? It's this thing that I hear about people buying, but it just doesn't seem like it's existing. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll be talking about the statewide survey. So first I want to look at the mission of the statewide survey, which is to provide timely, relevant, and nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions. We aim to inform and improve state policy making by raising awareness and encouraging discussion. We like to say that we provide a voice for all Californians in important state policy debates. And we've talked to over 350,000 Californians since 1998 in over 170 surveys that we've done since then. So this specific survey was conducted in early to mid-March, 70% on cell phone, 30% on landline. Just over 1,700 Californians were talked to with a margin of error of 3.4%, and just over 1,000 of whom we consider likely voters with a slightly higher margin of error. So there are two sections to the report, and the key findings, as Deborah mentioned, are on your, should have been given to you when you walked in. And so we focus in the front section on state issues, which include views on state elected officials, pensions, poverty, income inequality, housing affordability, and wildfires, among other things. And in the back half, we look at some federal issues, included approval of federal elected officials and policy preferences regarding federal taxes, immigration, and healthcare. So I think Deborah accurately captures it when she says it's a little bit ADD all over the place, but I think it's a very interesting survey. So let's start off looking at our California elected officials. As the state has become more blue and as state elected officials are becoming more Democratic, we're seeing that, just under half of Californians approve of Governor Newsom and the California legislature. About half approve of their own legislators in the assembly. Likely voters hold similar opinions on all of these folks. And there's, as you might expect, a big partisan divide here, with Democrats much more approving than Republicans. It is noteworthy that, fewer than 4 in 10 independents approve of Governor Newsom or the legislature, while just about half approve of their own legislator. Governor Newsom's approval only eclipses 50% in the San Francisco Bay Area among African Americans and among Asian Americans. A little tidbit about the legislature: going back 2 years, their approval has ranged from 46% to 51%. So over that time period, it really increased since 2017 on, whereas before then it was a little more up and down depending on what was going on with the budget and depending, of course, on the economy. regarding how Californians rate their own legislators, since January 2013, more than 4 in 10 have approved of their own legislators. And this tends to be a little bit more stable than regarding like the legislature, when we have seen them in the past go down fairly far into the 20s. The legislators, Californians generally view them a little bit more positively, and that's consistent with in other places and at the national level as well. So as Deborah mentioned, with tax season approaching, we like to ask these questions about how Californians are perceiving the amount of taxes they pay. And with half of Californians telling us in a separate survey question that the state and local tax system is not fair, it's not surprising that most Californians say that the per capita tax burden is near the top compared to other states. This perception increases with rising income and is far higher among Republicans than among Democrats. This perception has increased 19 points since we asked this in 2006. So it's increasingly becoming more of a common thing to say that California ranks near the top. And in fact, for the most part, these Californians aren't wrong. According to the most recent data from the Tax Policy Center, which was a report released in 2018 using 2015 data, California is the 10th highest. And so for the most part, Californians have their finger on the pulse of where they rate compared to other states. And when it comes to their personal tax burden, these perceptions also extend to this, where 6 in 10 Californians say that they pay much more or somewhat more than they should in state and local taxes. This perception increases with income. Republicans are more than 2 times as likely as Democrats to say they pay much more than they should. So the top category, Republicans are more than twice as likely. We find that about 4 in 10 across regions and racial ethnic groups say that they pay much more. And looking back since March of 2014, 3 in 10 or more have said that they pay much more than they should. So it's a consistent finding over time that Californians are paying more than at least they think they should. So we also asked about a number of issues and how Californians perceive them, whether or not they're a problem or not, starting with public employee retirement benefits. So when it comes to the amount of money that state and local are paying into their public employee retirement benefits, 6 in 10 say that this is a big or somewhat of a problem. And the share calling it a big problem is the lowest it's been in periodic surveys since 2005. So just 29% view this as a problem. If you've seen some of our other surveys, as well as some of the findings I'll report on later, 3 in 10 saying that something is a big problem for Californians doesn't really rank all that high compared to other survey questions. Republicans are twice as likely as Democrats to say that the amount of money paid in pension benefits are a big problem. And the perception that the amount paid is a big problem is highest in Orange, San Diego, and lowest in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the belief that pensions are a big problem increases with rising age. So given concerns about the unfunded liabilities of retirement benefits, Governor Newsom included in his budget proposal the idea of $5.3 billion in additional one-time spending to pay down these unfunded liabilities. This is an idea with just under half of Californians saying they support. A big partisan divide here with 6 in 10 Democrats in favor compared to just 1 in 4 Republicans who favor this idea. Independents are more likely to oppose this idea than favor, which is the partisan divide on this is somewhat surprising to me, and just because it's a one-time funding for an area that a lot of people at least in the legislature, have viewed it as a problem. But you have the majority of the majority of Republicans saying that it's something that they oppose. So it's something I'm going to be delving into a little bit deeper to kind of see what other elements there are here that could potentially be explaining this. Across regions on this question, we find that Inland Empire residents are more likely to oppose than favor, while elsewhere about half are in favor. African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos are more likely than white Californians to favor this proposal. So we also asked about poverty in a respondent's part of California and how big of a problem it is. And when asked about this, 8 in 10 call it a problem, with about half saying that it's a big problem. More than half of Democrats and independents say it's a big problem, while 4 in 10 Republicans say it is a big problem. Poverty is viewed as a big problem by majorities in the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, and Los Angeles, compared to fewer in Orange, San Diego, and the San Francisco Bay Area. About 2 in 3 African Americans say that poverty is a big problem, compared to fewer Asian Americans, Latinos, and whites. And we find that about half across age and education groups say that poverty is a big problem in their part of California. And this perception declines with rising income. Since May 2017, we found in periodic surveys that about 4 in 10 have said it is 4 in 10 or more have said it is a big problem. So this is an issue where we see that half saying it's a big problem, a little bit higher than the idea of the amount paid in pensions. So it's definitely an issue that is salient and is commonly found across regions and demographic groups. In his budget, Governor Newsom put forth an idea of proposing allocating $1 billion to expand the eligibility and payments to low-income working individuals and families as part of the state EITC. This kind of amounts to almost a doubling of the amount of money that was in the budget prior. And 7 in 10 Californians, a little bit over 7 in 10 Californians, including majorities across parties, favor this proposal. We also found that 7 in 10 or more across regions and 2 in 3 across demographic groups favor this $1 billion investment, but support declines with rising age, education, and income. So once again, we see high levels of support for this policy idea that was proposed in the Newsom budget. So moving from poverty to housing, we asked this question that's kind of adjacent to housing, basically getting at the idea, has the cost of housing caused you and your family to seriously consider moving away from your part of California? And we end up finding is that 45% of Californians say that they have seriously considered moving away from their part of California. And included in that is 35% say that they would move outside of the state, and fewer, just 9%, say they would move inside of the state. Younger people are more likely than older Californians, and renters are more likely than homeowners to say they've considered moving. Los Angeles residents are the most likely to say that they've considered moving, while Central Valley residents are the least likely. And we found that African Americans are much more likely than those in other racial ethnic groups to consider moving. We last asked this question in 2017, and it was similar, I believe it was 44%. However, far fewer held this view in 2004. So it's definitely the case that people are considering moving out of the state because of housing costs, and the data on the back end from the census data actually backs that up, where we're seeing that for the most part there's a net migration out of California. It's not as great as some people might say, and interestingly, the people that are moving out tend to be lower educated and lower incomes, and the people moving in tend to be higher educated and making higher incomes. So as California kind of sees people leaving, it's actually getting, there's a little bit of a return when it comes to more educated and more wealthy people. A lot of that, I think, is, from what I've seen of the data, is being driven by the metropolitan areas, the influx, whereas the outflux are coming from other parts of California. So as Deborah mentioned, most Californians are viewing housing affordability as a problem, with 9 in 10 Californians saying that. 2 in 3 Californians say it's a big problem, and it extends beyond just the metropolitan areas. And this perception is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there's been much talk about how much housing is, and it's lowest in the Inland Empire. And while majorities across parties say that housing affordability is a big problem, Republicans are much less likely than Democrats. And we also found that more than 6 in 10 across demographic groups say that this is a big problem, but this perception is higher among those with at least some college and those who haven't attended college. We found majorities since in 2017 and 2018 in March as well that have said that housing affordability, that similar shares have said that housing affordability is a big problem. So it's not necessarily a new issue, but it is something that in recent years has become, there's a much bigger drumbeat coming from Sacramento and localities to try to address the problem. Speaking of addressing the problem, Governor Newsom proposed in his budget spending $1.8 billion in one-time spending to spur housing production. This would include an expansion of state tax credits to develop low and moderate income housing. And when we found this, that 7 in 10 Californians, as well as likely voters, actually favor this proposal. More than 6 in 10 across demographic groups are in favor. Although support declines with rising income and age. Democrats are more than twice as likely as Republicans to favor this proposal, with 87% of Democrats compared to 39% of Republicans in favor of this proposal. So on this one, we do see a partisan divide similar to the on the pensions, while we didn't see as great of a divide on the idea when it comes to the state EITC. 8 in 10 renters compared to 6 in 10 homeowners favor this proposal, and across racial ethnic groups, whites are the least likely to favor this proposal. But once again, we see some pretty, outside of Republicans, we do see some broad-based support for this idea. So on the heels of one of the most destructive and deadliest years of wildfires, we find that 7 in 10 Californians call wildfires a problem in their part of California, with 4 in 10 saying it's a big problem. Obviously, wildfires are somewhat isolated in regards to where they actually occur, but as we saw last year, that is somewhat becoming less obvious when you saw some of the fires down in Southern California that are really close to some major population areas, as well as 2 years ago, the fire in Sonoma, which really impacted a lot of people. Nearly half in Orange, San Diego call this a big problem, compared to about 4 in 10 elsewhere in the state. Perceptions are similar across parties and increases with rising age. And nearly half of whites compared to 1 in 3 African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos say that this is a big problem in their part of California. So once again, Governor Newsom has put forth, in addition to declaring or proclaiming a state of emergency on wildfires just last week, his budget proposal called for $415 million in one-time spending on wildfire preparedness, response, and recovery, as well as forest management. 8 in 10 Californians support this proposal, More than 2 in 3 across regions, majorities across parties also support this proposal, although Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to be in favor. And we found that 8 in 10 across demographic groups are always also in favor of this. So it's broad-based support for a policy that Governor Newsom hopes will prepare California better for the upcoming wildfire season. And, $415 million is also kind of a lower amount than what we've seen in some of these others. And so as people are being asked this question, it could be also that, it's like, oh, it's just $415 million as compared to the $1.8 billion, the $1 billion, and so there are probably some relativeness there as well. So in Governor Newsom's State of the State address, he laid out his vision for the HighSpeed Rail project as well as the Delta Tunnels project. For the HighSpeed Rail project, his announcement spurred interest inside and outside of California, and his plans, at least for the near term, would be to truncate the high-speed rail system and focus solely on the area in the Central Valley, as opposed to extending it from LA all the way to the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we wanted to get at least an initial read on how people felt about this in a question that got people to say, just is this a good idea or a bad idea? And what we found is that Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to say that this is a good idea. And interestingly, with the high-speed rail being focused in the Central Valley, what we found there is that basically Central Valley residents are divided on this, with about 4 in 10 saying it's a good idea and a similar proportion saying it's a bad idea. 6 in 10 in the Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area say it's a good idea. And majorities of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos say it's a good idea compared to just under half of whites. So this is something that we'll continue to watch. But kind of notably is that we asked about a question last March about favor or opposing the high-speed rail project and kind of laid out the cost and where it would go. And interestingly, about half were in favor of that proposal. And so this idea of truncating it pretty much is perceived the same way as the whole system was perceived just a year ago. Now, obviously, there it was, we actually did give estimates of money and the bond amounts and whatnot, whereas this is just a kind of a first read on his plan. But it's noteworthy that there aren't big differences. So Governor Newsom's plan to scale back the Delta Tunnel project and building a single tunnel rather than a single tunnel in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Valley was received similarly to the high-speed rail project, with half calling it a good idea. Once again, Democrats and independents view this similar to their views on high-speed rail, with half or higher saying that's a good idea. But it's noteworthy that the Republicans are much less likely to call this a bad idea. So in this case, we see 42% of Republicans saying it's a bad idea, where that number is 55% for the high-speed rail. And so positive perceptions range from nearly 6 in 10 in the San Francisco Bay Area to less than half in Orange, San Diego. 6 in 10 African Americans and Latinos compared to about half of Asian Americans and whites view this as a good idea. So touching upon another issue that Governor Newsom has kind of spoken on recently, about 3 days into our fielding period, Governor Newsom ordered an executive moratorium on the death penalty. And bright and early that morning, it was the first discussion of the day is, should we ask something on this, given that we were very early in the fielding period and we were still able to, in the end, we were still able to talk to just over 1,100 Californians on this specific question. And so what we decided to do is just ask a tracking question that we've asked in the past. So this question isn't about The moratorium, it isn't necessarily specifically about the death penalty within California, but just a tracking question that we've been asking since 2000. And what we've seen is we see this move away from the death penalty and towards life imprisonment, where as the penalty for first-degree murder. So today we see a 2-to-1 preference for life imprisonment over the death penalty. And 3 in 4 Democrats say that life imprisonment should be the penalty for first-degree murder, while 64% of Republicans favor the death penalty. Independents are just over half say that they prefer life imprisonment, and that's over 20 points over those that say the death penalty. And we found the majorities across regions and demographic groups say that they would prefer life imprisonment over the death penalty as the penalty for first-degree murder. We hope to be able to come back to this topic and ask more specifically about the kind of moratorium potentially, but at this point in time, we thought that being able to provide at least a glimpse at how Californians' overall views are changing on this subject would be useful for people. So turning to the federal level, what we've seen is that this is pretty consistent. And I think it's kind of interesting that on your 2-pagers that you were given, if you kind of flip it from front to back, you would see on one side the kind of 3 charts for the state elected leaders and and the legislators, and on the back side in the same place, you see these numbers for the federal elected officials. So you can really see a difference, especially for President Trump in Congress, with fewer than 4 in 10 Californians saying they approve of their job performance. About half approve of their own representative, and that's consistent with what we saw at the state level, with about half saying they approve of their own representative in the state. Once again, as you might expect, a large partisan divide when it comes to President Trump and to Congress. But interestingly, you know, the divide is not as great when it comes to their own officials, with 1 in 3 Republicans actually saying that they approve of their own representative. Independents are fewer than 3 in 10 approve of President Trump or of Congress, but half approve of their own representative. So once again, reinforcing this idea that the view of your own representative is different. That's kind of an extension of the idea that someone who's closer to you, you view more favorably. And so like this is a person from your own area representing you. So and then the further away you get from your actual locale, approval and favorability tends to change. A little bit about President Trump's approval. Over the last 2 years, we've seen it range from a low of 25% to a high of 32%. So a very small range there. And that's consistent with what, for the most part, with the polling at the national level, where the kind of the partisanship is very, very wide, but the kind of gap of his approval isn't all that great. It's a little bit wider at the national level, but here you can see it's a very small range when it comes to how Californians have viewed him. Approval of Congress has not been this high since March of 2017. Partially probably responsible for that is the fact that now it's a Democratic Congress versus a Republican Congress we've seen dating back. And since 2015, approval of their own representative in the House of Representatives has been about 50%. And so that's a consistent finding over time. And once again, as kind of Congress or president kind of dip and ebb and flow, approval of how you feel about your own representative is much more consistent over time. And we found that fewer than half across regions and demographic groups approve of President Trump or of Congress. So turning to our U.S. senators, very interesting that Senator Feinstein and Senator Harris have very similar ratings across adults, likely voters, as well as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, with Senator Harris slightly better ratings among Democrats and slightly not as great ratings among Independents. And so what we also found is that African Americans are the most approving of either across racial and ethnic groups. And notably, while 51% in the Central Valley approve of Senator Feinstein, the number for Senator Harris in the Central Valley is 39%. So that's one of the areas where we actually saw a big difference between the two senators in the Central Valley. Women are 6 points more likely to approve of Feinstein, while they are 11 points more likely to approve of Senator Harris. And speaking of Senator Harris, given that California's will play a upfront role in the primary process, we wanted to ask a question that got at kind of how do Californians feel about Kamala Harris and running for the presidency. And what we found is that more Californians say that she should not run than should among all adults and among likely voters. It's also noteworthy that just a slim majority of Democrats say that she should run. 3 in 4 Republicans say that she should not, as well as half of Independents. We find that fewer than half across regions and demographic groups outside of African Americans say that she should not run. And I was curious, because obviously she has a higher approval than she does people who say she should run. So I was curious, among those who approve of her, how high is it that of a share that say that she should run? And what I actually found among all adults, there are 27% of those who approve of her that say she should not run, as well as 3 in 10 likely voters who approve of her that say she should not run. So obviously there's a much bigger story there regarding kind of why people may say she should not run. Maybe they have a favorite candidate other than her, whether it be someone less progressive, more progressive, or whatnot. So obviously there's a lot going on here. But as a kind of first look at her opinion of how people feel about her presidential run in California, more people saying that this is something that they think she should not do than should. So with tax season upcoming, or in the midst of it, I suppose, still haven't done mine, so don't judge too hard. We wanted to get at this idea of how Californians feel about the federal tax law that was passed by President Trump in Congress in 2017 and implemented for the first time in 2018. And what we find is that 6 in 10 Californians disapprove, 8 in 10 Democrats, 6 in 10 Independents disapprove, while 7 in 10 Republicans approve of this. So very much similar. If you look at the 29%, where else did we see that? The 29% that approve of President Trump more generally. So it's a very partisan issue. But we also do find, similarly to the approval of President Trump overall, that majorities across all demographic groups and regions disapprove of his job performance as well as this tax law. But beyond just kind of an up or down on the how people feel, we wanted to repeat a question that we asked, I guess in 2017, about how people thought the impact, or what people thought the impact of the law would be. And what we see today is that most Californians say that the impact of the law will be either there won't be much of an effect or mostly negative, with a slim plurality saying not much of an effect. As you might expect, there's this partisan divide, with half of Democrats saying that it has had a mostly negative, and half of Republicans saying it's had not much of an effect. Independents are pretty well divided here. African Americans and Latinos are more likely than Asian Americans and whites to say it will be mostly negative. And interestingly, those in our lower income category making less than $40,000 and those in our higher income making more than $80,000 are both divided, while those in the middle category between 40 and 80 are more likely to say that it won't have much of an effect. So turning to another national issue that's been in the news, we wanted to ask comeback, which seems like over the last 2 years outside of our special survey, we've asked about immigration policy on a very regular basis, not only because of the effect in the discussion at the national level, but also what it means in California and what it means along California's border. And what we've seen is that most Californians oppose or say that President Trump should not have declared a national emergency along the border. We find that 2 in 3 Republicans say that he should have, compared to just 5% of Democrats, and 1 in 4 independents who say that he should. And we see that 1 in 3 or fewer across regions and demographic groups say that he should have declared a national emergency. So once again, this is a partisan issue that in many ways is similar to his approval, but it's also a broad-based opinion among Californians that he should not have, with just 1 in 3 or fewer saying he should have across regions and demographic groups. So California has actively played a role in attempting to protect the rights of undocumented immigrants in California. And today, as we found the last few times we've asked this question, about 6 in 10 Californians say that they favor state and local governments making their own policies and taking action separate from the federal government to protect the legal rights of undocumented immigrants. Once again, this isn't asking specifically about, say, the sanctuary state policy, but just saying more generally, the state as well as localities, should they be doing things? As you might expect, there's a large partisan divide here, with in fact 78% of Democrats favoring and 78% of Republicans opposing. Independents are more likely to favor this idea than oppose. We find 3 in 4 Latinos and about 6 in 10 Asian Americans and African Americans favor this idea or this concept, while about half of whites favor this. And we find that the majority of Californians across regions and demographic groups are in favor here. So once again, a pretty broad-based support for this policy. When it comes to healthcare policy, Californians continue to be supportive of or have generally favorable views of the Affordable Care Act. This is quite timely given the news in recent days that there's going to be an effort to essentially via the court system declare the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional, and then we'll see what happens from there. But as you can see, it hasn't always been the case that the Affordable Care Act has been viewed positively in California. Early on, it was a very divided opinions, and then it became a slim majority. And we've seen a couple of spikes as of late. And then last May, it was all the way down to 45%. But before that, it was higher when the House was voting on, in September 2017, when the House was voting on the repeal. So it went up, and then after that, it kind of went back down, I think. And then since then, it's kind of risen again. Once again, this very stark partisan divide. Once again, independents falling on the side of favorable than unfavorable. And the views of Californians aren't all that different than the views of adults nationwide. In a March survey from the Kaiser Family Foundation, half of adults nationwide had a generally favorable view of the ACA, while 37% had an unfavorable view. So seemingly this is something that a majority of Californians and adults nationwide have a favorable view. So Governor Newsom also proposed in his budget $196 million to expand Medi-Cal coverage to low-income adults ages 19 to 25, regardless of immigration status. And so this being part of the proposal, we included that. And what we found is that 2 in 3 Californians and about half of likely voters say they favor this proposal. The stark partisan divide, and 6 in 10 independents saying that they also favor it. You do wonder, had we had more space and time in the survey, you do wonder how it would have been perceived if there was a question on expanding and then just, ages 19 through 25 question mark, period. And if you favored or opposed, asking, well, how would you feel if it applied regardless of immigration status? But given that the reality is that the proposal says that we couldn't really, didn't really have the time to ask both questions, we decided to ask the question that included that, and that's kind of the reality of where we are today. Support is higher among Latinos, African Americans and Asian Americans at 2 and 3 are higher compared to about half of whites. And support for this proposal declined sharply with age and income increases. And so as you can see, we were able to cover a lot of things in the survey regarding how people perceive issues as well as how they respond to policy proposals that have been put forth. And so in conclusion, we find that a plurality of Californians are approving of Governor Newsom and the state legislature. I should add that there were 3 in 10 Californians who said that they had either didn't know enough to have an opinion or didn't know how to rate Governor Newsom. So he still has a sizable share of California who at this point who can't rate him. We also found that Californians are divided on additional spending to pay down unfunded pension liabilities, but support different proposals to expand the state's EITC, spur housing production, as well as combating wildfires. Slim majorities support Governor Newsom's plan to scale back the HighSpeed Rail and the Delta tunnels. We found that, as we found recently, that majorities disapprove of President Trump and of Congress, while a slim majority approve of their own representatives in Congress. And we found that strong majorities do not agree with President Trump's decision to declare emergency along the border, and solid majorities support state and local action to protect the rights of undocumented immigrants. And so at this time, I would like to open it up to any questions with the reminder to just wait for a microphone before you start asking.
Hi, I have a quick question. When did you do the survey? Because I'm wondering, as people are doing their taxes now, if that would have influenced how they would have answered the tax questions. Because if you had called me a month ago, perhaps my opinion may have been different, because I just did my taxes recently, and I'm not happy. So
yeah. So it was March 10th to 19th, and this is, kind of, I guess we after the early birds have done it, but before people like me have actually, done their taxes, and so it's kind of in the middle. So yeah, you do wonder if in the future perhaps we should add a question in the demographic variables. Have you done your taxes or not? Because that could be an interesting break on how people feel, especially about you paid more than you should, because that's something that could definitely change given what you may or may not have to pay. So, yes.
Yeah, hi, good presentation.
Thank you.
The last election, a major issue was, I think, Proposition 6, that would repeal the gas tax increase. Have any of are you going to look at that again, or any of the questions you might have already asked, relate to that issue?
Yeah, we pulled that issue as in the lead up to the election, specifically about the ballot measure as well as some other questions. And we have asked over time questions about the gas tax. So we'll have to see kind of where we can fit it in. But as with a lot of things, it's always choices that you have to make regarding which questions to choose. And so, but the gas tax is definitely interesting, and we do hear it from time to time from folks that we speak with, and so it's definitely still salient. Yes.
Hi, I have two questions. First, on the out-migration question.
Yeah.
Have you looked at any other states to see if our numbers are way out of whack? I don't know if any other states have you seen any public polling on this in other states, but just curious to see if California is just like way out there. I mean, those are pretty high numbers of people.
I have not come across anything, but I also have not necessarily actively sought out. But that would be something good to see, or if at least there's like a national survey that you could have as a reference point. Perhaps that would be a really interesting blog that you could kind of pair with some actual kind of data on who's moving in and out as well. So.
And then my second question, before I came here, I did look at the historical data on the tax fairness question,
Yeah.
and like the moderately fair number is plummeted. Like it's by far the lowest you've ever tested.
Yeah.
Do you think that, I should have really looked at the dates, but I mean, what do you see? I mean, do you have any idea, any guesses on underlying reasons why that's collapsed so badly?
I don't necessarily have any specific thoughts, but it is, I think, as in recent years, we've seen more taxes, whether it be kind of, Prop 30 and its extension, the gas tax and other things. So I think there's at least a perception that that perhaps, and that you might have some people that are still saying they're fair, but then, I do recall that moderately fair number had dropped, and it seems like it was
10 point lower than any time you've ever tested.
And it seems like it switched over to more of the on the not fair or or not at all fair, and so that's definitely interesting.
Thank you.
Yes.
Question I saw in your independence and seeing some of the variation through there. I'm wondering for the future whether Green Party, Progressive, whether there can be any differentiation, because it seemed like on some parts there was a 50% and some degree that there was others. So just wondering for the next time, and thinking particularly between the next budget for June, whether you have any thoughts on that matter.
So we asked the question of kind of, like what party you registered as, and, as you know, the number of kind of other people who are registered in other parties is very small, but you can look at the kind of what's going to be becoming increasingly more important as the share of no party preference increases now, higher than Republicans. We know from the political science research that people say they're independent, but not a whole lot of people actually fall in that true middle category. There's a seminal book, The Myth of the Independent Voter, right? Like that there aren't really these true independents out there. And when push comes to shove, you have the majority of them who say that they would go one way or the other. In our survey, we asked that question. It's in the back of the report. But in recent months, I think it was about 1 in 4 who volunteer that they lean towards neither party. And so there are these true group of people, but you can create like a seven category party scale from strong Democrat to strong Republican, and that kind of true independent in the middle. But it tends to only be 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people who actually are these true independents. So. So if that's all, I think we may have qualified for the baseball bonus of maybe 5 minutes before the baseball games start at 1 o'clock. So yeah, thank you all.